They said no slave could escape without help. They were wrong. In 1850, one enslaved man proved that the greatest weapon against oppression was intelligence. He did not run blindly toward freedom. He engineered it. Surrounded by men who believed power came from ownership, he used their arrogance against them, turning their certainty into his camouflage. His escape was so carefully planned that it left no pursuit, no evidence, and no ending, only questions. How did a man with nothing outthink everyone who believed they owned him? Solomon Gray possessed a mind that could not be shackled, even when his body was bound by chains. On the Thornfield plantation in Southern Virginia, he was known as the Peculiar One, the enslaved man who could calculate the yield of an entire tobacco harvest in his head, who understood the movements of the stars, and who had taught himself to read by memorizing the shapes of letters he glimpsed on discarded newspapers. He was 32 years old in the spring of 1850, tall and lean, with eyes that seemed to calculate distances and possibilities even in casual conversation. His master, Edmund Thornfield, had recognized Solomon's unusual intelligence early on and had made the mistake of using it. Solomon became the plantation's unofficial accountant, keeping mental records of inventory, crops, and even the master's personal finances. What Thornfield failed to understand was that every piece of information Solomon absorbed became another tool in an escape plan that had been forming for over a decade. Solomon's gift had revealed itself in childhood. While other enslaved children played, he observed patterns in the weather, in the habits of the overseers, in the routines of the plantation. His mother, Rachel, had recognized his abilities and protected him fiercely, teaching him to hide his intelligence lest it be seen as dangerous. "A smart slave is a dead slave," she would whisper. But she also fed his hunger for knowledge, sharing stories of Africa, of their ancestors, of a world where black people walked free. When Rachel died of fever when Solomon was 17, something crystallized in him. His grief transformed into purpose. He would not die enslaved. He would not let his mother's stories of freedom remain just stories. Solomon's plan began not with maps or routes, but with understanding the systems that bound him. For 15 years, he studied everything. He learned that the overseer, Caleb Ruskin, drank heavily every Saturday night and slept deeply until dawn. He observed that the patrol dogs were kept in a kennel on the eastern edge of the property and were fed every evening at sunset, leaving them sluggish for hours afterward. He noted that supply wagons arrived every Tuesday and Thursday. Their drivers often looking for extra workers to help unload in exchange for news from other regions. From these drivers, Solomon gathered crucial intelligence. He learned about the Underground Railroad, though never directly. It was spoken of in codes and whispers. He discovered that Quaker settlements existed in Pennsylvania, that certain churches would shelter runaways, that conductors used the North Star and specific songs as signals. He memorized the names of towns between Virginia and the Canadian border, creating a mental map more detailed than any paper chart. But Solomon knew that intelligence alone wouldn't save him. The Fugitive Slave Act had made escape even more dangerous. Bounty hunters prowled the northern states, and even free papers could be challenged or destroyed. He needed more than a plan. He needed to become someone else entirely. Over the years, Solomon had cultivated relationships with both enslaved and free black people who came through the plantation. One was a free black barber named Isaiah, who visited Thornfield quarterly to cut the master's hair. Isaiah had fought in a war, possessed legal papers, and commanded a respect that even some white men grudgingly acknowledged. Through carefully orchestrated conversations, Solomon learned about Isaiah's mannerisms, his speech patterns, his history. He memorized every detail. Solomon also befriended a white indentured servant named Thomas Webb, an Irishman who worked in the plantation's carpentry shop. Thomas was bitter about his own bondage and sympathetic to Solomon's plight. Through Thomas, Solomon learned about the world of white society, how to speak with certain inflections, which behaviors would make him invisible, which would draw suspicion. The most crucial element of Solomon's plan involved documents. He had studied Thornfield's handwriting for years, practicing the loops and flourishes in dirt that he would smooth over immediately. He had stolen pieces of paper over time, hiding them in a hollow tree on the property's edge. From a traveling preacher who had left behind a book, Solomon had learned about different types of official documents, bills of sale, manumission papers, and travel permits. By March 1850, all the pieces were in place. Solomon had identified his window of opportunity, the week before Easter, when Thornfield would travel to Richmond for business and take Caleb Ruskin with him, leaving only a junior overseer named Potter in charge. A young, incompetent man, more interested in courting the cook's daughter than managing the enslaved workforce. Solomon had also been setting the stage for his disappearance. For months, he had complained of increasing pain in his leg, limping noticeably, convincing everyone he was becoming less able-bodied. He had also begun acting slightly forgetful, making small errors in his calculations. Nothing major enough to be punished severely, but enough to suggest his mental faculties were declining. He wanted his absence to be attributed to a crippled, confused man wandering off and likely dying in the woods, not to a calculated escape. The documents were his greatest achievement. Over the course of a year, Solomon had assembled a complete set of free papers. The paper itself came from the Thornfield study, stolen one sheet at a time. The seal was crafted from a piece of wax he had softened and pressed against an official letter, creating a mold into which he could press future impressions. The signature was Thornfield's own, practiced 10,000 times until Solomon could reproduce it perfectly. But the papers alone weren't enough. Solomon needed money, and he had been accumulating it for years. A penny here, a coin there, money dropped by visitors, small payments for extra work, coins discovered in laundry. He had saved every cent, hiding them in multiple locations in case one cache was discovered. By spring 1850, he had accumulated nearly $40, a fortune for an enslaved man. He also needed clothes. Thomas Webb, the Irish carpenter, had been persuaded to help, not directly, but through strategic neglect. Solomon had mentioned that work clothes sometimes went missing from the drying line, and Thomas had simply shrugged, making sure to leave his own spare clothes in predictable locations. Solomon acquired a proper shirt, trousers, a vest, and most importantly, a dark coat and hat that would help him blend in. The final element was misdirection. 2 weeks before his planned escape, Solomon began mentioning to other enslaved people that he had seen signs of runaways heading south toward North Carolina. where rumors suggested lenient Quaker communities existed. It was misinformation, but it would send any trackers in the wrong direction. April 12th, 1850, the Thursday before Easter. Thornfield and Ruskin had left that morning for Richmond. Potter was, as expected, distracted by his romantic pursuits. The supply wagon had arrived, and Solomon had volunteered to help unload, giving him a legitimate reason to be near the property's edge as evening approached. Solomon worked methodically, his heart steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. It clouded judgment and invited mistakes. Instead, he focused on the plan, reviewing each step mentally as he moved sacks of grain. As dusk fell, Solomon complained of his leg pain and asked to rest. Potter barely glanced at him, waving him away dismissively. Solomon limped toward the slave quarters, but veered off toward the hollow tree where his supplies were hidden. He had timed this moment precisely. The dogs had just been fed. The patrol wouldn't begin for another hour, and the household was focused on evening meal preparations. He changed clothes quickly, burying his slave garments deep in the hollow and emerging as a different person. The transformation was remarkable. Dressed in Thomas's clothes, standing upright instead of limping, with the confident bearing he had practiced from watching Isaiah, Solomon Gray, the slave, ceased to exist. In his place stood Solomon Gray, the free black man, traveling on legitimate business. He had one final task before leaving Thornfield property. Circling to the western edge, far from the buildings, Solomon reached a fence post where he had hidden one last item, a small wooden carving he had made, depicting a bird breaking free from a cage. He left it in plain sight on the post. It was a message to his mother, to the ancestors, to himself. I am free. Solomon walked through the night with purpose, avoiding roads at first, moving through forests and fields he had memorized from years of observation. He headed northeast, knowing that trackers would eventually search the main northern routes. His plan was to arc eastward first, then swing north, creating a pattern that would confuse pursuit. By dawn, he had covered nearly 15 miles. He rested in a dense thicket near a creek, allowing himself 3 hours of light sleep before continuing. This was the rhythm he would maintain, walking at night, resting cautiously during the day, always calculating, always alert. On the second night, Solomon encountered his first test. A patrol on horseback passed within 30 yards of where he crouched in tall grass beside a road. He had heard them coming from a quarter-mile away and had frozen completely, controlling his breathing, becoming invisible through absolute stillness. The riders passed without detecting him. By the third day, Solomon had reached the first station of his mental map, a Methodist church outside of Fredericksburg that he had heard was sympathetic to runaways. He approached carefully during evening prayer services, observant first. The minister was a middle-aged white man with kind eyes, and Solomon watched how he interacted with black congregants with genuine respect and warmth. After the service, Solomon approached, presenting himself as a free black man traveling north to seek work. He showed his papers, which the minister examined but didn't question, and asked for information about safe routes and work opportunities ahead. The minister, whether he suspected Solomon's true status or not, provided detailed directions to Quaker communities in Pennsylvania, and even gave him a letter of introduction to a fellow minister in Harrisburg. This became Solomon's strategy throughout his journey. He never presented himself as a runaway seeking help, always as a free man traveling legally. This accomplished two things. It reduced the risk of betrayal by those who might fear harboring fugitives, and it allowed him to gather information openly. His forged papers were excellent, and his bearing was so confident that few questioned him. He worked occasionally as he traveled, taking day jobs that paid in cash and meals, loading wagons, helping with harvests, repairing fences. This served multiple purposes. It provided resources, it made him seem like a legitimate traveler, and it gave him opportunities to hear news and gossip that might indicate pursuit. Back at Thornfield, Solomon's absence wasn't noticed until Friday morning, nearly 36 hours after his escape. When Potter finally realized Solomon was gone, he initially assumed the enslaved man had wandered off, confused and injured. A cursory search of the immediate grounds revealed nothing. When Thornfield and Ruskin returned on Saturday and learned of Solomon's disappearance, Ruskin was enraged and immediately organized a proper search party. They found the buried clothes, the carved bird, and realized this was no simple wandering. It was a calculated escape. Ruskin assembled a hunting party, including professional slave catchers and their dogs. They tracked Solomon's initial route easily enough, but by Sunday, 2 days behind him, they found themselves confused by his eastward arc. Most runaways fled directly north. Solomon's route suggested different logic. The hunters split up, some heading north to check the standard underground railroad routes, others following Solomon's actual trail. But Solomon had been careful about his tracks, often walking in creeks, doubling back, and using hard ground that left minimal trace. By the time the hunters reached Fredericksburg, they were searching blindly, asking at farms and taverns about a runaway slave, while Solomon had passed through as a free man, asking about work. What Ruskin didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Solomon had studied the psychology of hunters. He knew they would expect fear, desperation, and mistakes. Instead, he gave them confidence, patience, and misdirection. Every choice Solomon made was designed to exploit what pursuers expected versus what he actually did. 3 weeks after leaving Thornfield, Solomon crossed into Pennsylvania. The psychological weight of reaching free soil was profound, but he knew the Fugitive Slave Act made even northern states dangerous. He couldn't relax his vigilance. In Harrisburg, Solomon presented the minister's letter of introduction and found work at a Quaker-run warehouse. The Quaker family, the Dawsons, were immediately welcoming. They didn't pry into Solomon's past, but he sensed they understood. They paid fair wages, provided a room, and treated him with a dignity he had rarely experienced. For 2 months, Solomon worked for the Dawsons while preparing for the next phase of his plan. He knew that true freedom required more than just escaping slavery. It required building a new life with security and legitimacy. He needed education, credentials, and a documented history as a free man. The Dawsons connected Solomon with other members of the Quaker community, including a lawyer named Joshua Hart, who helped freedmen establish legal identities. Hart was impressed by Solomon's intelligence and bearing. When Solomon explained that his papers were from Virginia, but he wanted to establish himself permanently in Pennsylvania, Hart helped him obtain additional documentation: a Pennsylvania residency permit, a letter of character reference, and enrollment in literacy classes, though Solomon was already far more literate than he pretended. During this period, Solomon also began teaching. The Dawsons learned of his mathematical abilities and connected him with a school for black children, where he began tutoring. This wasn't just charity. Solomon was building a reputation and an identity as an educated free black man, creating layers of legitimacy that would make his background increasingly difficult to challenge. He also changed his appearance. He grew a beard, changed his hairstyle, and adopted glasses with plain glass, but they altered his appearance significantly. The Solomon Gray, who had escaped Thornfield, was being buried beneath Solomon Gray, the Pennsylvania teacher and tutor. In July, 4 months after his escape, Solomon experienced his most dangerous moment. He was walking through downtown Harrisburg when he saw 2 men who looked like professional slave catchers, showing a sketch to merchants. His heart rate increased, but he forced himself to remain calm, to analyze rather than panic. Solomon didn't run. Running would confirm suspicion. Instead, he walked confidently into a nearby bookshop, a place a fugitive slave wouldn't likely enter, and began browsing. Through the window, he watched the men. They were indeed searching for someone, but their sketch showed a clean-shaven man with short hair, limping and wearing work clothes. They were looking for the Solomon who had left Virginia, not the bearded, bespectacled, well-dressed tutor who now stood reading a book on mathematics. One of the men entered the bookshop. Solomon's blood ran cold, but he continued reading, even making a comment to the shopkeeper about the book's quality. The slave catcher glanced at him, then looked past him, his eyes scanning for someone who fit the image of a desperate runaway. Solomon was invisible precisely because he was so visible, standing openly, engaging confidently, occupying space like a man with nothing to hide. The slave catcher left. Solomon purchased the book, not because he needed it, but because it's what a legitimate customer would do. He walked calmly back to the Dawson warehouse, his exterior calm, betraying none of the recognition that he had just survived the moment of greatest danger. That evening, Solomon made a decision. Pennsylvania was free, but not safe enough. He needed to go further. By October 1850, Solomon had saved enough money and established enough connections to make the journey to Canada. The Dawsons, by now fully aware of his status and deeply committed to his safety, connected him with conductors who could facilitate the final leg of his journey. Solomon traveled to Buffalo, New York, again as a free man traveling for work opportunities. From Buffalo, it was a short ferry ride across the Niagara River to Canada, to land where the Fugitive Slave Act had no power, where his freedom would be absolute and unquestionable. On October 22, 1850, Solomon Gray crossed into Canada. As he stepped off the ferry in Fort Erie, Ontario, he felt something he had never fully experienced: the complete absence of fear. For the first time in 32 years, no one could claim ownership of his body. No law could send him back. No hunter could touch him. He fell to his knees on the dock, not in weakness, but in overwhelming release. Tears came, tears he had suppressed for decades, tears his mother never got to shed, tears representing every enslaved person still in bondage. He wept for what had been stolen and for what he had reclaimed. Solomon Gray settled in Toronto, where he established himself as a teacher and later founded a school for black children, including refugees from slavery. He married a woman named Ruth, also a former slave who had escaped via the Underground Railroad, and they had 5 children. He never returned to the United States, though after the Civil War ended slavery, he corresponded with people who had remained at Thornfield. He learned that his escape had become legendary among the enslaved population of Virginia, the story of the man who had outwitted the system so completely that the hunters gave up, believing he had either died in the wilderness or somehow made it to some unreachable sanctuary. Edmund Thornfield died in 1867, having lost his fortune during the war. In his later years, he reportedly spoke with grudging respect about Solomon, admitting that the enslaved man had been smarter than him all along. Solomon lived to be 83, dying in 1901, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all free, all educated, all carrying forward the legacy of a man who had refused to accept that his mind could be owned. His escape wasn't just about leaving physical bondage, it was about proving that intelligence, planning, patience, and courage could overcome even the most oppressive systems. In his later years, Solomon wrote a memoir that became required reading in black schools throughout Canada and the northern United States. The final passage read, "They called me property, but a mind cannot be owned. They called me inferior, but I outthought them at every turn. They called me slave, but I was always free. In here." He tapped his head. The body may be bound, but the mind that plans, that hopes, that strategizes, that refuses to accept injustice, that mind is the truest form of freedom. My escape began not the night I left Thornfield, but the moment I decided that I would rather die free than live enslaved. Everything after that was merely execution of a plan that an unshackled mind had conceived. Solomon Gray died free, successful, and surrounded by love. The man who planned his escape so brilliantly that he was never captured, because he understood that true escape required not just leaving the place, but becoming someone new. His intelligence had been his greatest weapon, and he had wielded it with precision, patience, and profound determination. His legacy lived on, not just in his descendants, but in the example he set, that the human spirit, armed with intelligence and resolve, can overcome even the most brutal oppression.